Perhaps the most important reason why millions voted for Narendra Modi is the hope that he will lift the economy out of the trough into which it's fallen. So is yesterday's good news about inflation and industrial production the first sign this is happening? Or could it prove misleading? And beyond that, is this government showing the resolve needed to push through reforms, or is it unnecessarily cautious, thus delaying the return to 8% growth? My guests are the former Secretary General of FICCI, Rajiv Kumar, the well-known author and former CEO, Gurcharan Das, the Bombay correspondent of the Financial Times, James Crabtree, and a former member of the Planning Commission, Arun Maira. Rajiv Kumar, let's start with the state of the economy. Yesterday, it was announced that in September, industrial production had grown by 2.5%, whilst retail inflation has only increased by 5.5%. And both figures were considerably better than anticipated. How much cheer do you take from those two outcomes?
Karan, I take a lot of cheer from the inflation coming down below 6%, retail inflation coming down below 6%. But I'm not so sure about the industrial production, because I think it's more of a flash in the pan. Because it was the capital goods which are very volatile, which have shown an uptick, and the consumer demand, the consumer goods section continues to have a substantial negative trend for the last 11 months, except for 1 month there. So, and the investment demand, which if I was to take the credit offtake or the available or the absorption of financial resources by the corporate sector, is still declining. It is 1,000 billion rupees lower than 2013 during the period of April to October. So I'm sort of quite actually concerned with the fact that this year we might well see an industrial growth of no more than 3% and an overall growth of GDP of around 5%. And I think we need to not at all. We need to remember that this is challenging and take steps to get it back on track.
Gurcharan Das, I want to pick up on, in fact, that very note of concern that you heard from Rajiv Kumar. If you look at GDP growth during the April-June period, it was 5.7%. It cheered the country. But I'm told that for the July-September period, it's going to be sizably lower, because industrial production and exports have slowed down, and because agriculture will have been considerably dampened by the poor monsoon. Equally, the inflation figure that looks so good could now show the opposite direction, because the Kharif output is likely to be something like 10 million tons less than last year. So the question I want to ask is this: have we turned a corner, as perhaps the government wants to claim, or are we just going around one of many bends on a snaky road?
Well, I think as far as inflation is concerned, we have bottomed out. We have turned the corner, and I think the fight against inflation has probably been won, and therefore I think the Reserve Bank really should now start moving.
What about production? What about industrial production?
Frankly, I agree with Rajiv. Yes, I agree with Rajiv that the industrial production is fragile. The numbers, it's not broad-based, and frankly, there's no trend at the moment to suggest that we have begun the recovery. So to help that recovery, I think it's important for the Reserve Bank to start moving.
Now, James Crabtree, in contrast to what you've heard about industrial production from both Rajiv Kumar and Gurcharan Das, I'm going to quote to you the Business Standard's main leader today. This is what it says: given the virtual stagnation of the industrial sector over the past couple of years, now there are growing indications that the economy is finding its way out of the trough. Would you, as a fellow financial journalist, agree with that optimism? Or do you think the paper's being somewhat over-optimistic?
I think that's probably a fair comment. It's finding its way out of the trough, but the trough is very low. As your two previous contributors said, industrial production has stagnated in the last 2 or 3 years. The banking sector is undercapitalized. The country's largest conglomerates, who you'd expect to be investing in new factories or steel mills, are all heavily in debt. And so it will take more than the measures the government has currently introduced to fix all of that. And so that, I think, is why caution is warranted.
Okay. While we're still talking, Arun Maira, about what I call the state of the economy, I want to discuss with you the state of the fiscal deficit scenario that stares the government in the face. Do you believe that it will meet that fairly awesome challenge of 4.1% that Arun Jaitley has taken on? Or do you think, even though oil prices are now hovering somewhere around $80 a barrel, the real problem is that indirect tax collections between April and October, that's the first 6 months of this year, are just about 5.6% compared to the budget target of 20%. And as the papers made clear on the 1st of November, the government has already hit 83% of its fiscal target for the whole year. So are you worried about the government's ability to meet that 4.1% figure?
I think, Karan, if you'd ask that question to Rajiv, he'd probably give you a more informed answer on that one. I would really like to continue to explain why I believe we are turning around with respect to investments coming into the country and an increase in the industrial growth also, which you will not see now.
Can I then stop you?
But you are going to see
I'll put that question to I'll stop you. I'll stop you for a moment. I'll put that question to Rajiv Kumar, and then I'll come back to you to ask you why, in fact, you believe investments are coming in and why you believe a corner's been turned. Would you answer that question for me, Dr. Rajiv Kumar, about the fiscal deficit and the challenge and whether it can be met?
Karan, it's a very tough challenge. The government has had a bonanza in the global oil price coming down so that the fuel subsidies will be lower. And they've also already now announced a excise rise on petrol and diesel, which will give them 13,000 crore. All of that critically depends upon whether the disinvestment program of the government, which is expected to mop up about 65,000 crore, which is $10 billion between now and end of March, comes good. So therefore, very tough. I don't think it could be met except if the disinvestment really picks up despite the fuel subsidies being down. But what I'll want to say in the second part is that if I was the finance minister, I would not bother about the fiscal deficit at this point of time, because you need to pump up demand, and the credit rating agencies will look at what you're doing with your money in improving capacity in the economy, rather than be dogmatic about the fiscal deficit number that we've been has been quoted by everybody.
So what you're basically saying, and I'm just saying it for the audience in layman's terms, the 4.1% target is a very challenging target. Whether it's met or not depends critically on how successful we are in terms of disinvestment. But you also added, it's not a target that you should worry if you miss, because you need to pump up demand. Let me then go back at that point to Mr. Arun Maira. Explain to me why you believe, in contrast to the others, that we may have turned a significant corner and why investments are now coming in. Explain that, Mr. Maira.
You know, Karan, since September last year, we've had 3 peaks or turnarounds in the trend of industrial production numbers, and 3 declines also. So it's something superficial on the surface that goes up and down. What we have to go down is to look at the deeper currents underneath, which will change the whole pattern. And there, one must find out, why is it that we were not getting people investing in the country, especially Indian companies, and what they were complaining about was not about the fiscal deficit as much, that things don't happen on the ground. They wanted a state that functioned, that made things happen as they were required to happen. And it's very good to hear this morning Mr. Birla, Kumar Mangalam Birla, in the front pages of the paper saying that whereas 2 years ago he was the one who loudly said that he's not investing in India, he's investing abroad, saying now India is number 1 on his list of countries where he's going to invest. Now foreign investors, especially foreign long-term investors, FDI investors, want to know what Indian business people are thinking and doing, and therefore I say that confidence is building up in Indian business people that this government can get things done. And may I just say one thing? When the boat is leaking, it doesn't matter which direction you're setting the boat, fix the leaks. And I think this present government is inspiring confidence in citizens as well as in business people that they're fixing the leaks in the system.
I take that, and I'm going to put that, in fact, as a question to Gurcharan Das. You have a very interesting answer there, Mr. Das, from Mr. Maira. What he says is, in essence, if the government does sufficient work to get the system itself functioning, to open up the bottlenecks that were clogging up and putting off investors, if you plug the leaks, it doesn't matter in which direction you're actually heading, because you'll still be moving. Do you therefore accept that what the government has done in terms of quicker decision making, better implementation, more responsive bureaucratic functioning is sufficient to take us to 8%? Or is it still critically short of those structural reforms which many believe the government is ducking?
Well, I think it may not be sufficient, but it's a lot. And I think we should actually not underestimate the power of all the things that have been happening in an incremental way, day by day. And you know, these incremental things do add up. Let's see what they are. For example, the diesel decontrol. Now, it was helped by low prices, but the fact they've done it. Railways fare increased by 15%. No fare increase had been increased for a decade, and they did that. Then they opened FDI to defense, and people said, oh, but 49% is not enough. But in fact, I know a lot of foreign companies and Indian companies are tying up in the process. And so you know, there are a number of things like these which are, I mean, the best example is coal.
Let's not get lost in detail. Let's not get lost in detail.
Coal is very important, Karan. Coal, because that describes the way they're going about it. They've just announced actually the breaking of the monopoly of Coal India, but they've done it very quietly.
Well,
now this is a big deal, because after the 34 blocks are done, the next 100 blocks are open for commercial mining.
Okay, let me stop you there. I want to bring in James Crabtree, because I know that the Financial Times and James's own writings take a fairly different view. You've heard James Crabtree, Gurcharan Das argue that a lot of incremental things seen together as a whole add up to quite a lot. The alternate view, and I'm putting that to you to ask if you agree with it, the alternate view is that there's a lot more talk about reform from this government than actual delivery. For instance, they've failed to abolish retrospective taxation or reverse it. They simply promise they won't do more of it. On labour law reforms, they've tinkered with provident fund portability, and they've reduced the scope for vexatious inspections, but they are not moving towards hire and fire at all. Even on something like coal, the ordinance talks about making commercial mining possible, but it hasn't set a date when it will happen, and Piyush Goyal doesn't suggest it's going to happen soon. And finally, on land acquisition, they are talking about increasing exemptions, but not necessarily making it cheaper or easier to actually acquire. So when you look at those things, which many foreign investors consider important, do you think sufficient is being done, or do you think it's more talk and less delivery?
No, and I think you've given a number of very good examples there where what this government is doing is heading in the right direction, but shuffling in that direction rather than taking large steps. The coal example is an excellent one. They have said that they're going to do something very radical, but that's all that they've said. They haven't said how they're going to do it, which legislative changes, by what time scale, and therefore I don't think any foreign company who would want to be a miner in India would take that terribly seriously. So I think, you know, you have to have a balanced perspective on this. The government is heading in the right direction, but often it's only doing so rather slowly. And in the end, if you keep going slowly, you won't get very far.
You know, Rajiv Kumar, you have a very interesting diversion of opinion between Gurcharan Das, who says a lot of little things add up to quite a lot, and he listed several of them. And you've got James Crabtree saying that the big bullet that needs to be bitten are those deep structural reforms to do with land acquisition, to do with labour law, to do with reversing retrospective taxation, and there the government is ducking it. Where do you come in on that difference of opinion? Do you agree with James, or do you agree with Gurcharan Das?
Well, in a sense, I agree with both. I'm not trying to dodge it. It is that there is a lot that has been done in 5 months, and one must give the government credit for it. It has set the scene for improving the investor sentiment. But I think the government and the Prime Minister realizes that the next 3 or 4 months are absolutely critical, because everybody has been given the government the benefit of the doubt, and as they should. And I think this benefit of the doubt will remain until the next budget. So between now and the next budget is the time for the government to take those large steps that James is talking about. But I must focus on one specific one, and which is the tax regime. The tax regime has been horrendously perverse in the last few years, and not just for the foreign investor but for the domestic investor too. And therefore you not just don't have the Vodafone, but also you have the Nokia case, and you've got all sorts of domestic investors being plagued by transfer pricing, etc. So what I would have thought that the government must do, and I think it's about to with the change of guard in the Central Bureau of Direct Taxation, is to rationalize, simplify, and take decisive steps and announce them on the tax regime.
Okay.
That's one part. And the second part is that on the Land Acquisition Act, and again I think the government has announced its intentions, and now they must act. The next 3 or 4 months, if there is movement, I'm sure the investment sentiment will be up, because that is the key. You've got to get the investment cycle going. At the moment, the investment cycle is not just flat, but still downward sloping.
You said, Arun Mehra, that you believe confidence levels were rising. I'm going to quote to you what the Japanese State Minister of Finance, Yasutoshi Nishimura, told The Hindu just 2 days ago on the 11th. He said, and I'm quoting him, Japanese companies will move forward with investment. He was talking about the $35 billion promised by Abe to Mr. Modi, but only if there is a visibility with regard to these critical structural reforms. Now, he's not showing too much confidence. He's actually setting down a conditionality instead. And that's the sort of thing that you felt wouldn't matter to investors, but he's clearly saying it does. Mr. Mehra?
Karan, please, it does matter to investors, of course. At the end of the day, yes, I'm saying it does matter to investors that you take the big decisions and make the structural changes. But you got to prepare the ground to be able to make those structural changes, and they should stick. And I think people are smart enough to realize that a government that just announces things and can't get them done thereafter is no good for them. They want leadership which builds the ground and then takes the tough decisions which people accept and they get done.
Okay.
I've just read a terrific book by a don in Oxford, a political science don, who's talked about the myth of the strong leader, and it's worthwhile because I looked through the lens of that book at what's happening in India, and I get confidence because he said going in history 300 years in all countries of the world, when big reforms were done, what the leader had been able to do before that was to win the confidence of the people that I am with you, I recognize what you need, and we are going to make that happen. And then to work out the political coalition to make the big ticket reforms happen, which will then be supported by the people also.
We're running out of time. I'm stopping you, Mr. Mehra. We're running out of time. I'm simply going to underline for the audience that you take confidence from an Oxford don, and I'm very glad. That's my old university. But let me quote to you another Oxford graduate who became Prime Minister of Britain, Margaret Thatcher. She didn't wait for consensus. She thought consensus was a dirty word. She said, when you have conviction instead and you push through what you believe is right, people follow and act. So there are two opinions, even from Oxford graduates, on precisely how reforms are done and how important is consensus versus conviction. I'm sorry we've run right out of time at that point. My thanks to all four of my guests for joining me. There we end this particular episode. And if you have been, thanks for watching.